the reason why online reputation management is very important for large language models is because large language models functions off.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Jolly SEO's TLDR. I'm your host, Greg Heilers, co-founder at Jolly SEO, where we specialize in earned link building and not just links these days, but brand mentions, which is perfect to introduce our guest, Bernard Huang, the founder of ClearScope, who I am relying on today to help me understand how we get our brand represented well in this new age of AEO. So Bernard, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.
It's always an honor, a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Greg. Love just poking the boundaries of this new world that we're all forced into understanding.
That's right. Yeah, we were talking pre-recording. It's been about 5 years, actually. I did the math since we were talking, since you were last on the podcast. And since then, all of us in SEO have been adjusting to a lot of moving targets these days. So we like to keep it frank in these podcast recordings. And today we're going to talk about, like you said, pushing the boundaries of what we do and don't know, right? We were talking about pre-recording the state of attribution. It's still murky. And I had hoped things were going to get clearer, but you kind of corrected me on that and said, in your opinion, not so much.
Not so much. So when we talk about attribution, I think in a historical sense, one would think about booting up their Google Analytics. I reminisce fondly of GA3. I know we're at 4, but it's that state where you could then say, okay, this user came from search and then converted on my site, and search is the attributable source. And we were talking, and my opinion is that attribution is very dark right now, in the sense that if ChatGPT sends you, does it actually get attributed correctly, right? And so if ChatGPT, you're talking with it, and then it cites one of your pieces of content, and then somebody clicks on that, sure, you're going to get that refer source equals ChatGPT, but in a lot of ways, the tracking is becoming a lot more intangible. What I mean by that is that if a user is asking prompts about the topic that you want to be mentioned in, and the model mentions you, what the user is likely to do is not click on a source, because GPT is not giving, clear sources when it mentions you, but you're going to Google the brand, and then you're going to click on the homepage or whatever page you land on, and then guess what gets attributed? It's search, right? It's not AI like traffic. Also, with all the data privacy laws and concerns going around everywhere, cookies and all this tracking stuff is just a lot more nightmarish. And that's why I think attribution is only going to get worse.
Yeah, so are we thinking of it more directionally? I mean, we talked about branded search. I know I wrote a piece for Moz years ago. Morgan did as well. Just here at Jolly, we focused on branded backlinks for so long that we were saying, well, hey, if your branded search goes up, it's not exactly one-to-one causation, but it's correlation. We're doing something right over here for our clients if your branded search is going up. Is that what we're trying to see as SEOs or AEOs, that if our clients' branded search is going up, that we've managed their brand's reputation in ChatGPT somewhat effectively?
Hey, hope you're enjoying the show. We're going to get right back to it. Real quick, if you're not sure how you're showing up in AI tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, and the like, click on that first link in the description. If you fill that out for us, we'll send you your own AI visibility report and see how we can help you boost your results. All right, without further ado, remember that link and enjoy the rest of the show.
I think it is one of 3 indicators at this point So branded search, yes, right? If you're being mentioned by GPT, Gemini, Claude, then your branded impressions will go up. And that's a symptom or that's like, yeah, something that you get from boosted AI visibility. The problem with that is that, for a larger brand, let's say they're running a Super Bowl ad, like obviously your branded search is going to go up there. So it's not a clearly like, okay, your AI visibility is going up. But overall, you're doing well digitally. And, everything does have like a halo effect within one another. So that's one. The two other ways that people are thinking about at least attribution within AEO is a brand mention and a AI citation. And there's been a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about the validity of an AI citation, why it matters, and a brand mention and why it matters. But there are also holes within each one of the different variables. So brand mention is you ask the model, what are the best, whatever, and then the model mentions your brand, right? Did it mention it? Did it not mention it? And you can measure that, right? You have a lot of different AI prompt tracking tools. ClearScope can now help with that as well. But the problem with brand mentions and just solely using that is that not all prompts deserve brand mentions, right? If I'm prompting what is AEO to Gemini, Gemini is not going to start spouting out like ClearScope this or Tool X that. It's just going to be like AEO is, the concept of improving visibility in AI and, this, that, and that. I mean, maybe they might recommend some tools, but it's not a given. And the lack of you being mentioned on an informational or research prompt isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? And so you can't get dinged if no brands are being mentioned. So those are the holes in like brand mentions. AI citation is the last like metric that I would track in terms of AEO. And AI citation refers to the fact that in certain cases, models will give sources or citations to web pages or domains that it is pulling some percentage of information from. And so when you see that and you see your page being cited or being used as a source, you can then say, okay, that's a good thing because clearly the model trusts my brand or my domain enough to be quoting or citing my web page. However, there are holes with this as well. And the fundamental biggest hole that we are currently seeing is within model bias suppression, which is like the fancy way of saying Gemini doesn't want to recommend a brand and then use content from that brand. So what it ends up happening is that, for a best SEO tools prompt, you're not going to see Ahrefs or SEMrush or all of these different very popular tools being cited because the model is saying, I do not trust any of those because I am recommending them. Therefore, I will not cite anything that comes from those domains. So, right, if we look at it in that way, and we're tracking the prompt, best SEO tools, Ahrefs gets brand mentioned but didn't get cited. Should we really be penalized, right, as AEOs for not getting the citation when the model literally will not give brands being mentioned a citation? You can't. So anyways, it's a weird state of attribution, and that's why I think it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this point in a conversation, realistically, is where half throwing our hands up in the air, half being pragmatic, we would say, like, so what can we do? I had Nick Ranger on the podcast a few weeks ago, as of the time of recording, and she had explained to me and then our audience query Fanout. And so the reason that I'm excited to talk about this with you is, ClearScope, as far as I understand the history and when we last recorded, you guys were related to content production and optimizing content originally. And content itself is changing. And so Nick was saying that for their clients, she uses Query Fanout like we used to do with topic clusters. Uh, but her advice was all in one, like monster epic page we're trying now to capture everything related to the topic. And so I'm curious your perspective. I know that we may not always get those citations either way. But at the time of recording, with the models we've got anyway, moving targets as they may be, what do you think about this? Are we shifting away from having dozens of pages to try to be the one-stop resource, or are we literally trying to have it be just one stop on our own website to capture an audience?
Great question. Love Nick. Love that, she's thinking about query fan out in, this particular world. And I think that the answer is neither here nor there. So what I mean by that is that we have also been doing extensive research into query fan out. And query fan out refers to the fact that when you ask models, any prompt, the model will perform searches grounding with different engines, primarily Google, to validate or augment the response that they're about to give to the end user. Fundamentally, this is important because models are trained on data that has a knowledge cutoff. The latest Google models are only updated to January of last year. And so if you're asking anything that has to do with freshness or current events or, anything in 2026, Gemini is not going to know or have any history of knowing. So it must search. That brings us to the fundamental interesting component then of web searches. First off, when we were testing this at ClearScope, we would call the API once. Gemini would perform its searches, and then we would say, okay, well, the way to then get your brand and your domain in front of Gemini as a large language model is to intersect it when it's doing its web searches or query fanout. And so we would then design individual pieces of content to target each one of the searches with the idea that by increasing our domain surface area for the different subtopics that Gemini is searching for, we will have more probability to influence the model in all of the different searches that are happening. I believe, Nick's firm, Dehan, has also done extensive research that proves that, there is a grounding budget, something like 2,000 words or something like that, that the models are currently allowing for, the grounding to influence. And the going thought back then was that if you have 5 pages and it performs 5 web searches and all 5 of your pages, are in the top 3 spots, well, you're going to get a lot more of that budget than if only 1 page or in, like a couple of those spots because it was a big, hub page, topic cluster, whatever. So that was the going thought. We tested it. And what we learned very quickly, and this is now how we're iterating on this idea, is that web searches are fundamentally probabilistic. What I mean by that is that each time you call Gemini for, a specific prompt, it will search, but those searches have frequencies. So there's a lot of different ways that we're thinking about this. This is super nerdy stuff. But when you call Gemini's API and you actually set the temperature of the large language model to 0, what you're doing is you're saying, give me no variance in your response, right? A temperature of 1 is basically the standard of what users interact with models. And that's to say, okay, within, a bound of possibilities, you have 100% of that leeway to kind of float between, 20 to 70%, depending on, what the large language model is feeling. At temperature 0, there's no deviation, right? So we're basically at the closest understanding of what the large language model is suggesting. And we're testing basically only creating content against web searches performed at temperature 0, because that's fundamentally what the model is always going to do. Those sets of web searches become, I think, a lot more important than, the ones that just get searched 5% of the time or 10% of the time. At the same time, what we are doing is we're taking temperature 1 and we're pinging the API a lot of times. And what we're getting back is a distribution of web searches being performed over the course of 100, 1,000, permutations. And what we're finding is that temperature 0 web searches correlate strongly with highly frequently searched things that the model cares about. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. But then you start to see that there is this long, long tail of somewhat gibberish, somewhat, coherent stuff where it's like, best free SEO tools 2026 for small business. And that happens like, 2% of the time. And you might then say, okay, well, that 2% of the time, who cares? So all of this is to say my updated understanding of how to tackle web searches happens to deal with the frequency of occurrence and the model's own fundamental understanding. Against web searches where temperature is 0, you definitely want, full holistic pieces of content, high quality, targeting those particular searches, because the models are definitely trying to look that up. However, for the, web searches with way less frequency, you have to pick and choose the ones that make sense if you have a limited budget, but pick and choose the ones that make sense, understanding that this variance that's happening also correlates to probably memory and context stuff that the model has already been presented with. Right. So back to that example where Gemini performs, free best SEO tools for 2026 small business, chances are, right, there is a small percentage of people who Gemini classifies as a small business. And when they search, best SEO tools, Gemini will fire off, that particular web search for that particular user because they've found that to be relevant to the user. So for the long tail, I still believe that, you want to cover those in singular pieces of content. So now you have your topic clusters that are targeting the head terms, which are the highest frequency in terms of web searches that are happening, whether that's temperature 0 or you sampled a large set using temperature 1. And then you want to create long tail content targeting each one of the lower frequency searches and hopefully just target the ones that are relevant for your business.
Yeah, fascinating. It's a tricky. I like that you mentioned grounding budget aside. You also mentioned financial budget for not just the SEO, right? That company or the in-house marketer or the small business owner. It's a lot to think about covering. And I want to shift gears on you here because we already talked about how tricky search attribution can be, but we also talked about even though we may not have direct attribution, we do think directionally that users are, and hey, again, moving target. Today it's ChatGPT and Gemini. Tomorrow we don't know, but they are using these search platforms increasingly so. So I wanted to ask you about brand reputation management. We both have talked about this topic before, and I'm always trying to learn here. And so I just want to show my cards. I always like to be honest with the audience, the limit of my knowledge here. Bernard, this is as sophisticated as I am right now. I am asking either about prompts, let's call them the old school terms, money keywords, or the most commercial keywords relevant to my business, or I'm searching about my brand directly. Is Jolly SEO a good link building agency? These basic kind of search terms. And then I'm pulling open the side panel of sources or citations. and I'm trying to see what is influencing ChatGPT's responses related to me or to my key terms. And then I'm reaching out to those websites in most cases. I'm actually, in some small cases, thinking like a link builder would, trying to outbuild them, maybe outrank them, so to speak, to use the old school Google terminology. But in most cases, I'm reaching out directly to them saying, hey, can you update this for this? Because that's not exactly accurate, trying to position myself in a better light. But as simplistic as that sounds, that's about as sophisticated as Greg is today. So I just wanted to know, Bernard, seeing that and hearing, as far as I've gotten, what are some other things that we can do when we see ChatGPT, for instance, give a neutral or negative review of our brand, either in a direct search about us or in a really important term related to our business?
Greg, your playbook is the most solid I've ever heard. So I'll just leave it at that, right? If you think about fundamentally how large language models work, you have to think about three different layers. You have A, the training data layer, B, the validation layer, and C, the memory and context that the model has about you as a user. So when we're thinking about online reputation management, and the reason why online reputation management is even an important aspect to discuss in the first place, happens to deal with how large language models work, right? SEO is built primarily on links, right? If New York Times linked to you, it votes with high authority because it itself had a lot of links. So, it passes that link equity to whoever it's linking to. That was at least simple enough as it is. The reason why online reputation management is very important for large language models is because large language models functions off of entities and topics and co-occurrence, right? That's why there's this whole thing where, you comment spam on Reddit or Quora or whatever, and people are seeing results, right? Because what ends up happening is that you're injecting brand and topic co-occurrence that the large language models pick up on, right? The patterns. And then by picking up on them, they start to then want to recommend your brand for the topic that it's seen over and over and over again, right? So that's why online reputation brand management is super important. That said, training data, right? You could try to affect training data, but that's hard and that takes a long time, right? Again, Gemini's latest training data was only trained till January of 2025. So you were either in that snapshot or you weren't. And, you now have, I guess, 13 months to have built up some more stuff to have a hope or a shot to influence the next snapshot of training data. That's unreliable, right? And so essentially what you just laid out is, okay, how do I then affect the validation layer when the model is grounding itself with search? And you're specifically targeting the sources that the models are citing and, performing direct outreach to those particular websites. That's exactly how you would influence it. It just so happens that Reddit is oftentimes included in these citations, which is why Reddit has been a fast shortcut for AEO digital marketing practitioners to hop on the bandwagon for. But other than that, you basically cannot influence the model, right? It's either the training data or it's whatever it's grounding in search. And with the sources being laid out, those are the, that budget that it assigns. That's the only way. I'll just add the caveat, a little asterisk that says we're also testing the same idea from a frequency of sources and grounding and temperature 0. And we're finding that sources also have basically variance and frequency. So if you're going to perform outreach, you basically want to perform outreach on the citations and the sources that are 100% or close to 100%. And you're going to see that as well if you ground ground it and then temperature 0, or you just hit the API, 100 times, you're going to see the sources also have a frequency and importance that's associated with them.
That's a really fantastic takeaway because as I was sharing, we're doing the outreach, but not spray and pray just to defend myself, but I wasn't discriminating against the sources with any real scientific method. There was just subjectively, oh, this one looks like I have a shot at reaching out to them, but as you say, maybe they were only going to show up in that one search anyhow. So maybe I didn't need to spend my time there, time being limited. I wanted to push you, before we get to my favorite question on the podcast here towards the end, I wanted to push you a little bit, look into your crystal ball, Bernard. You mentioned Reddit. We offer Reddit brand mentions now. How could we not? It's 2026. Do you think a year from now in 2027, we'll be here talking about Reddit? Do you think in 2028, what do you think the future holds for that one? It's already, we've seen varied over time in its influence. Some people think it'll go to 0. Some people think it'll remain relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer lies in how Reddit is managed. That's all that I can say. So currently, Reddit has been a gold mine of unique, interesting, human-led discussions around topics all around the world. However, everybody has noticed that, Reddit's a pretty big part of how trading data works, so on and so forth. So a lot of people are spamming it, whether they're spamming it through some semi-automatic manner or purely automatic manner, or just, human, like hand by hand way. It's happening. So I think that if Reddit can fight off all of the spam, and again, I don't know how they do that. Maybe to be a Reddit participant, you have to, like expose your identity, and only people who have exposed their identities can contribute to Reddit. Because if you don't, you're not trusted, or you might be an AI, whatever, right? And so I think that if Reddit can hold its ground in terms of being an oasis for humans to discuss topics and trends and whatever it is that they want to discuss, then Reddit will continue to be a valuable source of data for LLMs and AI to tap into. If Reddit loses the war and Reddit becomes AI filled spam, whatever, loss in customer trust or user trust, then the value of Reddit will diminish like any other, heavily spammed platform.
Yeah, very logical. Bernard, I really wanted you to come on because of all the research you conduct over at ClearScope. I mean, you guys are very scientific about your approach to these topics. And so my favorite question of this podcast is actually to ask you, what did I not ask you? What did I not even think about? It's more of a don't know what I don't know issue here that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up.
I mean, yeah, usually people ask about like predictions, people ask about, like search traffic. I would say it's probably just, yeah, like predictions is what you haven't asked, at least explicitly. You asked for the Reddit like prediction, but yeah, I think the prediction of like, okay, what's going to happen to search and traffic like moving forward is probably the question that I get asked a lot.
Well, you've seen SEO through a couple pivots. So both of us are dealing with not just companies changing, but models changing on the fly on us. And so do you see, I guess my prediction question for you then would be, Bernard, do you see us needing to pivot more rapidly in the near future, or is the dust going to settle at some point here? I mean, the arms race from my end seems like it's just heating up. What do you see?
Yeah, I think that the word pivot, I think is interesting. I think that there are certain things about AEO that differ from SEO. And so in those ways, yes, you should pivot some of those strategies away. And, aspects of that could be, you know, building a bunch of backlinks to one page, right? Because in the SEO world, you ranked number one if you did that, and then you got all of the traffic. But in an AEO world, it doesn't play out like that, right? Like I think either in pre-recording or during this like conversation, we were talking about how Gemini likes to reduce bias in its recommendations. And so if it's deciding to mention MailChimp as part of a prompt, is this the best like email marketing software, or what are the best email marketing softwares? It's not going to rely on what MailChimp has to say, even though MailChimp's article on the best email marketing software could be ranked number one, right? And so those are like aspects of things where you need to pivot your way of thinking. And then I think the other way that you need to pivot is how you measure how you're winning, right? And so I think there's a lot of misconception where leadership teams are breathing down SEOs, content marketers, and saying, well, get back my traffic, like get it back. We used to do 100,000 visits a month. Now we're doing 40,000. So, what's the plan to get it back? I think that is probably the most fundamental pivot that you need to make as a marketer communicating to leadership. And what you need to tell them is that the traffic is not coming back, right? Instead of traffic, you're going to get brand mentions or AI citations or branded queries or searches that are happening. And it's very important for leadership to understand that so that you can start to pivot your resources, right? Maybe a little bit away from all of these other activities that served the traffic aspect and more towards online reputation brand management, creating content targeting the fan out of queries rather than what users are searching for, right? And so these are the adjustments that I think you have to make.
I think that's spot on from what I've seen. I for years have struggled to position Jolly SEO's services because SEOs, from my perspective, were often in-house in the performance marketing side of the budget. They were right up against the PPCs fighting for that budget. And I always aligned better with the brand marketers when we were able to work with them. And that's how I saw our work. And I think a lot of SEOs in the past year and a half or so have been waking up to the fact that we are marketers. And if you're able to communicate with leadership and reposition yourself as part of the brand marketing budget rather than the direct attribution performance marketing, I think you may find that you can get more alignment with the work you're doing. I think that's spot on, Bernard. Look, none of us have a crystal ball, but I've really appreciated your insights today, Bernard. Obviously, people should go to clearscope.io. Where else can they look you up if they want to ask you some questions directly?
Yeah, I would say I'm the most active on LinkedIn currently. So you can find me, add me on LinkedIn. And then we do have a newsletter at ClearScope. That's where we share our learnings. That's where we have our webinars with awesome speakers. So, sign up for that if you want to stay up to date on the latest in AI visibility.
Fantastic. Bernard, thank you so much for coming on today. See you next time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.